This is the second Sunday after Christmas, whereon the church lectionary always allows us to hear this wonderful gospel reading of the story of the coming of the Magi. Even though the Feast of the Epiphany, of course, doesn't fall to until January the 6th. Now, I know most of you on this call understand how Christmastide works, but maybe not all of you, because the way the church celebrates the Nativity is quite different from the way secular society does. You may notice that you don't hear Christmas carols being sung at St. John's right after Halloween or even right after Thanksgiving. Not usually even in December until we get right to the precipice of the feast. So we keep this season of Advent as a time of waiting and patience. And then we celebrate the 12 days of Christmas. Now, almost everybody knows about the 12 days of Christmas because they know that on the 12th day of Christmas, my true love gave to me 12 drummers drumming. But I'm always amazed at how many people don't understand how it works. I once heard on a radio station the announcer speaking of the 12 days of Christmas as the 12 last shopping days before Christmas. And this year I don't know why it always surprises me, I should know, but I had to go into Fred Meyer on December the 26th. And when I walked in the store, my jaw dropped. It was as if Christmas had never happened. Nothing, no decorations, nothing. It was gone. It was over. And so as I said, we keep 12 days of celebration when everybody else is sick of the whole season. Some of us still have our Christmas trees up and we're singing the carols and so forth. And then we get to the 12th day of Christmas, January the 5th, and 12th night. Most people have heard of 12th night because of William Shakespeare, but that's leading right into the Feast of the Epiphany. Now, even so, you may ask, if you know about this, you may say, well, why do we have two different feasts of the Nativity and then the Epiphany? Isn't it all just the same event? Well, actually not. We've sort of made it that way, but it was never intended to be that way. Now, first of all, we have four Gospels in the church. Most scholars agree that Mark is the earliest one. And Mark makes no mention of Jesus's birth. It's not important to him. He wants to focus mainly on Jesus's suffering and death and resurrection. And in order to get that there, he tells us about his ministry. Many scholars call Mark's Gospel a passion narrative with a prologue. But he starts with John the Baptist and Jesus in the wilderness, and then goes from there. Of course, last Sunday, we heard that beautiful prologue from the Gospel of John the Evangelist, where he doesn't really talk about the birth event either. He goes back farther. John's Gospel has this high Christology of mystic meaning where he equates Jesus with the eternal Word that was in the beginning with God, and the Word was God. Beautiful. So it's only in Luke and Matthew that we hear about Jesus's birth, and they're completely different stories. Luke is the only place that we hear of what we think of with our Christmas pageants, of Mary and Joseph and the baby in the manger and the shepherds out in the field abiding with their flocks and the angels singing to them and telling them to go see this wonderful thing. Only in Luke. Matthew makes no mention of it. And likewise, Luke makes no mention of the story that we just heard, that Matthew tells about the coming of the Magi, or the wise men from the East. And, we've put these two stories together, which is interesting what we do in our minds, because they didn't even happen chronologically at the same time. If you listen to that story, the wise men saw the star at Christ's birth, and then they followed it, but they didn't get on a jet to Tel Aviv. They had to come on camels. And it took a long, long time. In fact, it's usually considered that it took about up to 2 years. And the reason you say, well, why that? Well, if you noticed, Herod, who was a megalomaniac and very paranoid about his claim to the throne, was very concerned about rumors of a new king being born. And so he ascertained from them when the star had first appeared, in other words, the birth. And then we didn't hear it this morning, but of course, the famous and terrible story of Herod putting the holy innocents to death, all the young boys in the area 2 years old and younger, because that's the time frame. So, you know, I hate to tell us all this, because I'm the one that put the wise men in the creche this week so you would see them, but they never went to the creche. They weren't there. The shepherds, if they had waited for the wise men, would have had to move in with Mary and Joseph for 2 years. No, the wise men story, again, if you notice, it says when they got there, they went into the house. They were living in a house over which the star had appeared. So we've put these stories together, and that's fine, because this whole feast is about mystic meaning. In fact, the gifts that the wise men gave have always been seen to have this mystic meaning: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. You know, the gold signifies the kingship of Christ. You only give gold to royalty. The frankincense signifies the high priesthood of Christ. It was the priest in the temple who offered the incense. And then the myrrh, we often don't think about myrrh because it's not a part of our lives, but it was a strange, strange gift to give a little baby. Myrrh was used in that society to anoint the bodies of the dead, to cover over the odor. And so that gift was seen to point to the little baby's death. And of course, the significance of his saving death for all humanity. So we give these mystic meanings to these gifts. And in fact, the whole story has been extrapolated. You know, we all know about the 3 wise men, right? Well, Scripture never says it. You never heard Annette read about the 3 wise men in that story. It says wise men came from the east, bearing gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. There were 3 gifts, but it could have been 2 wise men, or it could have been 12. We don't know. But by the Middle Ages, they each had a name. They each came from different parts of the world. They represented different races. And just so we're aware of that, I don't think we have to take our wise men out of our creche. It's all good, because it's an aid to help us enter in to the mystic meaning of this event. I sort of think of the Christmas Epiphany bookends as 2 different ways of looking at the incarnation. Christmas Day celebrates the joy, the thanksgiving of God taking on human flesh in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, being born into our world to live and die as one of us. It's joy, celebration, and thanksgiving. For me, at least, Epiphany, it's those things too, but Epiphany focuses more on introspection. What is the meaning of that birth, and how is it manifested? In fact, the word epiphany in Greek means manifestation. It's about it being made known and what is the meaning. And it should be no surprise that the Eastern churches of Christianity, the Orthodox, who tend to have a more mystical bent, a stronger focus on the Holy Spirit, where we in the West pretty much only talk about Jesus. They have a much bigger appreciation for the Feast of the Epiphany, and they don't just relegate it to the manifestation of the Magi. In fact, this feast, by the way, is also called the manifestation of Jesus Christ to the Magi, to the Gentiles. But for the Orthodox, it's sort of a threefold manifestation. And alongside the coming of the Magi, just as important, in some ways, maybe even more so, is the baptism of Christ by John in the Jordan River, where the Spirit descends upon him and the voice of God is heard to say, "This is my beloved child with whom I am well pleased." This manifesting Jesus's relationship with God. And then the third one is Jesus's first miracle at a wedding in Cana of Galilee, where he changed water into wine. Episcopalians love that miracle because we love weddings with wine. But we have tried in our church to sort of reclaim that threefold understanding of Epiphany in the last generations of liturgical renewal by, one, always celebrating the Sunday after Epiphany as the baptism of Christ, which we will do next week. And then we sort of nod our hats to the third one by once in our 3-year cycle, once every 3 years, on the following Sunday, we get to hear the story of the miracle at Cana in Galilee, of the water turning into wine. But all through these Sundays after Epiphany now, till we get to Lent, we're going to be hearing stories about Jesus healing and doing signs and wonders and calling his disciples, always that his relationship with God and humanity were made manifest. So Christmas, the joy, the thanksgiving; Epiphany, the manifestation and the deeper meaning. Now, I am not a poetry aficionado. You probably won't ever see me in the bookstores under the poetry section buying anthologies of poetry. But I do have certain poems in my life that have affected me deeply. And probably my most favorite poem of all time, because I think it's one of the most profound that I have ever read, has to do with his Feast of the Epiphany. And I've shared it with you before, but I think, personally, I think it should be heard every Epiphany, no matter what. It's sort of like, can you hear "'Twas the Night Before Christmas" on Christmas Eve too many times? Of course, I'm speaking of T.S. Eliot's The Journey of the Magi. And the reason it so impresses me is because a number of things. It reminds us that this search for the Christ child is a lifelong journey, and it's often hard and arduous. And it also reminds us that when we do finally find Christ, it's very often in the mundane and the ordinary, not spectacular at all. You might even miss it if you're not paying attention. And then lastly, I love it because it does what I think every good Christmas carol does. If you read closely the words to Christmas carols, it connects the birth event of Jesus with the death event, as this Feast of Epiphany does with the gift of the myrrh. And not only that, it connects it with our own death in a number of ways and meanings of that word. So I'd like to share with you T.S. Eliot's Journey of the Magi. A cold coming we had of it, just the worst time of the year for a journey, and such a long journey. The ways deep and the weather sharp, the very dead of winter. And the camels, galled, sore-footed, refractory, lying down in the melting snow. There were times we regretted the summer palaces on slopes, the terraces, and the silken girls bringing sherbet. Then the camel men cursing and grumbling and running away and wanting their liquor and women. The night fires going out and the lack of shelters, and the cities hostile and the towns unfriendly, and the villages dirty and charging high prices. A hard time we had of it. At the end, we preferred to travel all night, sleeping in snatches, with the voices singing in our ears saying that this was all folly. Then at dawn, we came down to a temperate valley, wet, lying below the snow line, smelling of vegetation, with a running stream and a watermill beating the darkness, and 3 trees on the low sky. And an old white horse galloped away in the meadow. Then we came to a tavern with vine leaves over the lintel, 6 hands at an open door dicing for pieces of silver, and feet kicking the empty wineskins. But there was no information, and so we continued and arrived at evening, not a moment too soon, finding the place. It was, you may say, satisfactory. All this was a long time ago, I remember, and I would do it again, but set down, this. Were we led all that way for birth or death? There was a birth, certainly. We had evidence and no doubt. I had seen birth and death, but had thought they were different. This birth was hard and bitter agony for us, like death, our death. We returned to our places, these kingdoms, but no longer at ease here in the old dispensation, with an alien people clutching their gods. I should be glad of another death. May the reveling of Christmas bring you to the introspection of Epiphany. May your resolve to find God incarnate carry you through the journey of life. May Christ be made manifest to you in the most ordinary of places. And may you rejoice in the death of the old ways of clutching and alienating as you enter into the life of joyful sacrifice. Happy Epiphany.